You might be happier at a less demanding facility, Miss Ross. That is what Dr. Whitfield said 17 minutes before the code alarm that would begin his destruction. Cedar Creek Medical's 4th floor smells like bleached linolens and burned coffee, the antiseptic undertone sharp enough to catch in your throat if you breathe too deep. Danielle Ross moves through the corridors with economy of motion, each step deliberate, her limp barely visible except when she climbs stairs. The stairwell is empty at 1:19 p.m., and that's when her gait shifts, muscles memory overriding the careful civilian shuffle she's maintained for 2 years. By the time she reaches the medication station on 4 North, she's walking like a nurse again. Like just a nurse. The cart gleams under fluorescent lights. She organizes syringes with precision that would make a pharmacy tech weep, cardiac meds pre-drawn in labeled 3 milliliter syringes, timing notations in her meticulous block letters. Digoxin. Amiodarone. Nitroglycerine. She learned to prepare these at 0400 hours in a field hospital outside Fallujah, where delays meant flatlines and flatlines meant flag-draped transfers home. The field hospital habit dies hard. Some habits never die at all. Room 347 is her 3rd check. She pretends it isn't. She organizes a cart, checks a chart, moves down the hallway like every other room matters equally. But her hand brushes her scrub pocket, thin fabric, tarnished military challenge coin heavy as a grenade, when she passes his door. Marcus Webb sits by the window, service dog at his feet, dark glasses hiding surgical scars that run from temple to temple like lightning. He's 28 years old and carries himself like a man who survived worse than most people can imagine. Because he has. Danielle doesn't stop. She never stops. The rule is distance. The rule is embedded protocol. The rule is 2 more years of watching from the margins until the investigation concludes and Marcus can testify and the classified operation that brought her here finally closes. But she touches the coin. Miss Ross. Dr. Whitfield appears at the medication station like a silk tie-wearing plague. His tablet gleams against his chest, patient photos, and charts and billing codes and a dozen other things he thinks matter more than breathing. He stops at her cart, lips curling in that expression he's perfected over 32 years of institutional medicine, the smile that isn't a smile. It's a warning wrapped in dental work. We need to discuss your creative interpretations of protocol, he says. His voice carries just enough to turn heads. 2 resident physicians pause. A nursing assistant glances over. He knows they're listening. He wants them to listen. Danielle nods once, face blank as surgical stone. She doesn't look up from the syringe she's labeling. These pre-drawn medications, Whitfield continues, gesturing at her cart with one manicured hand. They violate pharmacy timing requirements. Medications prepared more than 2 hours in advance compromise sterility parameters. You understand that, surely? She understands. She also understands that cardiac patients in acute decompensation don't have time for a pharmacy tech to draw medications from a locked cabinet while they're actively dying. She learned that lesson when a soldier named Chen flatlined because a pharmacy delay cost him for minutes. He didn't get those for minutes back. He got a flag-draped funeral and a letter his mother never read because she died of pneumonia 3 weeks after the service, just stopped living the same day her son stopped breathing. I understand, Dr. Whitfield. Her voice is soft. Deferential. Just a nurse apologizing to a doctor for overstepping. It's a voice she practiced in the mirror for 3 weeks before she arrived at Cedar Creek. It's a voice that belongs to someone small, someone who accepts correction, someone who has no business questioning institutional protocol. Whitfield's smile deepens. He's won the exchange. He doesn't recognize that he hasn't. These procedures, he gestures broadly, they suggest a concerning pattern. A belief that your judgment supersedes established guidelines. He pauses, letting the words hang. It raises questions about your fitness for this level of critical care. Cedar Creek maintains standards, Miss Ross. Rigorous standards. The medication station falls quieter. Someone coughs. A monitor beeps 3 rooms down, steady and rhythmic and utterly indifferent to this conversation. Danielle caps the final syringe. Labels it. Places it in its designated location on the cart. Her hands are rock steady. Her jaw tightens imperceptibly, just the faintest tension visible if you're trained to read micro-expressions in combat conditions. She's been trained. She's been trained by people whose job was reading whether an insurgent was about to detonate a suicide vest from the twitch of their eyelid. I'll review the protocol, Dr. Whitfield. Thank you for the clarification. She meets his eyes for exactly 1 second. Long enough to show she's heard him. Not long enough to show that nothing he says matters, because what matters is Marcus Webb in room 347, and what matters is keeping him alive until his testimony concludes the operation, and what matters is a challenge coin in her scrub pocket that cost her a spinal fusion and 8 months of learning to walk again. Whitfield's smile hardens. He doesn't like that she didn't break. He doesn't like that her voice remained steady, that her hands didn't shake, that she accepted his criticism with the composure of someone far more secure than the situation suggests a floor nurse should be. I hope so, Miss Ross. For your sake. He adjusts his tablet, studying something on the screen that probably isn't important. Because there's only so much room in this department for nurses who think they know better than the physician supervising them. Cedar Creek maintains standards. We have limited patience for those who can't meet them. He leaves. Just walks away, his shoes clicking on polished tile with the authority of someone who has never questioned whether a room would accommodate his presence. The nursing assistant looks at Danielle with something like sympathy. She ignores it. Sympathy is a luxury she can't afford. Sympathy draws attention. 2 hours later, at the vending machine on the 3rd floor, she's retrieving a black coffee when Whitfield rounds the corner. He's not alone. 2 attending physicians flank him like remoras following a shark, laughing at something he's said, something medical probably, something that signals how much harder the attending physicians work compared to the floor nurses, how much smarter they must be to have accumulated the credentials that Whitfield is radiating like expensive cologne. Miss Ross, he says. Still working? Admirable. The 2 attendings exchange glances. One almost smiles. They know what's coming. I was just discussing with Dr. Chen and Dr. Martinez here, Whitfield continues, his voice dropping into that register that's not quite a whisper but commands attention anyway, the concerning patterns we've been observing. Patient advocacy is wonderful, truly. But sometimes nurses confuse advocacy with authority. Sometimes they believe their instincts override training. Sometimes they struggle to accept that their role, important though it is, has limitations. Danielle retrieves her coffee. The cup is still warm. Steam rises, and she watches it dissipate into the recycled air. You might be happier at a less demanding facility, Whitfield says. Somewhere with lower acuity cases. Somewhere the expectations align better with your skill set. I'd be happy to make some calls. There's a lovely extended care facility in Pearland. Wonderful culture. Much less stressful. Dr. Chen looks away. Dr. Martinez studies his shoes. I appreciate your concern, Danielle says. She doesn't look at him. She sips the coffee, black, bitter, honest. I'm committed to Cedar Creek. To the standards here. Are you? Whitfield steps closer. His presence makes the air pressure change in the small vending machine alcove, not physically, but perceptually. The kind of presence that comes from 2 decades of institutional power, 3 failed marriages, a 7-figure net worth, and a certainty that every room he enters exists to accommodate him. Because it seems like commitment would involve respecting the protocols that 35 years of establishment medical practice has proven essential. Not improvising. Not pre-drawing medications based on what you think might prevent complications. Following procedure. Which suggests you're either uncommitted to our standards or incapable of following them. Danielle drinks her coffee. The cup makes a quiet hiss of air escaping as she peels the plastic lid slightly. That's the thing about standards, Miss Ross, Whitfield continues, his voice still low enough that it's just for her, just for the 2 doctors who are uncomfortably present. They protect patients. They protect the hospital. And they protect nurses like you from making mistakes that could end careers. I hope you understand that my concerns come from a place of professional interest. She doesn't respond. Whitfield waits. In his experience, people always respond. People always crack under the pressure of being told they're failing, that they're not good enough, that the institution they're part of is fundamentally better than their individual judgment. Danielle isn't people. If your attitude doesn't improve, Whitfield says, his voice dropping even lower, I won't have any choice but to have security escort you out. Hospital policy is quite clear about insubordination. And I'd hate to see your career derailed by pride. Really, I would. 3 seconds pass. Then 4. Whitfield turns to leave, satisfied. His established dominance. He's made clear the consequences. He's demonstrated that Cedar Creek Medical doesn't accommodate nurses who think they can practice medicine without a license. What Whitfield doesn't know is that Danielle Ross is not a nurse. What he doesn't know is that the woman standing in the vending machine alcove with a cup of black coffee has served 23 years in classified operations across 4 continents. That she's extracted wounded personnel from hostile territory under mortar fire. That she's performed emergency procedures in sandstorms while insurgents fired at her position. That she's held the rank of Master Chief Petty Officer in the United States Navy SEAL teams. What he doesn't know is that she's embedded at Cedar Creek Medical specifically because Marcus Webb, the blind veteran in room 347, is the key witness in a military intelligence investigation, and someone needed to keep him alive, keep him safe, keep him breathing until his testimony could be recorded and classified and locked away in Pentagon archives. What he doesn't know is that she's been shot at by professionals and lived. That she's been interrogated by people whose job was breaking human beings and walked out with operational security intact. That she can maintain composure while insurgents light tires on fire around her position. So a silk tie-wearing hospital administrator suggesting she might be happier elsewhere doesn't register as a threat. It registers as noise. As something that belongs to the civilian world she's performing in while the real operation continues 17 meters down this hallway in room 347. Danielle finishes her coffee. The cup crumples quietly in her hand, a sound barely audible, like a gear settling into place. She returns to the 4th floor at 1600 hours exactly. The shift change briefing is happening in the nursing station, and she listens to the night shift taking report while updating charts with movements so economical they barely disturb the air. Someone mentions a new admission to room 319. Post-surgical. High risk. The kind of patient that Code Blue likes to find when staffing is thin and the hospital is quietest. Danielle makes a note. Not on paper. In the part of her brain that's been trained to process information in hospitals in Mosul, in clinics in Kandahar, in forward operating bases where the difference between preparation and panic is measured in blood loss per minute. She touches the tarnished challenge coin in her scrub pocket, the one Marcus Webb's father gave her in Baghdad 20 years ago, before Marcus was a soldier, before any of this mattered. When Marcus was 8 years old and caught in crossfire and bleeding and she pulled him toward a helicopter while shrapnel buried itself in her spine. The coin is warm from her body heat. It's the only thing from that day she kept. Everything else is classified. Everything else is sealed in archives and redacted reports and conversations that will never be officially recorded. But the coin is real. The coin is witness. And somewhere in this hospital, in a room on the 4th floor, a blind veteran is sleeping under guard by someone he thinks is just a floor nurse who cares too much about protocol. He has no idea who he's sleeping next to. He has no idea that the woman checking his vitals every 2 hours is the same person who carried him through Baghdad burning, who held his intestines in while waiting for a medevac, who never told anyone because the mission always came first. What happens next doesn't yet know it's about to become a legend. The medication card gleamed under the fluorescent lights of Cedar Creek Medical, every vial organized by time, every syringe labeled with military precision. Dr. Whitfield paused in front of it during morning grand rounds, gesturing like a museum curator presenting a cautionary exhibit to the gathered residents and attendings. 10 residents. For attendings. All eyes on the carefully arranged cart, then on Danielle. This is what happens when nurses think protocol doesn't apply to them, Whitfield announced, his voice carrying the casual cruelty of someone accustomed to an audience. Miss Ross here believes her judgment supersedes pharmacy timing requirements. She pre-draws cardiac medications to prevent delays, as if Cedar Creek operates like some field hospital in, where was it again? Baghdad. A resident smirked. Someone whispered. Whitfield continued without pause, his tone dropping into that particular register reserved for teaching moments at the expense of subordinates. Perhaps those facilities had lower standards, but here we follow evidence-based medicine. We follow the chain of command. We don't improvise. He smiled at the residents. Remember that. Danielle stood 3 feet from her own cart, hands clasped at her waist, jaw absolutely still. Her breathing didn't change. She didn't blink. A muscle near her right temple didn't twitch. She had learned in Baghdad that composure was armor, that the moment you reacted to humiliation, you gave it power. So she stood there and let Whitfield use her as a prop, let him shape her into a lesson about overreach and ego, let him paint her as reckless in front of the people she'd work beside for the next 8 hours. Her eye stayed focused on a point just past his left shoulder. When the procession moved on, a first-year resident lingered, staring at the medication cart with new suspicion, as if it might explode. Danielle began reorganizing the vials again, though nothing had been disturbed. The motions were automatic, muscle memory from field hospitals where you kept your hands busy because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant feeling. That afternoon, the vending machine hummed its mechanical rhythm in the basement corridor. Danielle inserted coins with the same methodical precision she applied to everything else. Dr. Chen and another attending, Dr. Marcus Pierce, clustered nearby pretending to debate the virtues of the stale coffee. Whitfield arrived like he'd been waiting for an audience, his timing too perfect to be coincidence. Still here, Rambo. His voice carried up the hallway with deliberate volume, meant to be heard. Thought you'd have transferred to someplace more your speed. Maybe urgent care. Somewhere they appreciate the creative approach to patient care. Chen laughed. Pierce smiled into his coffee. Whitfield leaned against the vending machine with the ease of a man who'd never once doubted his place in a room. I mean, we all respect initiative, but initiative without protocol is just chaos, isn't it? Danielle's hand emerged from the vending machine with her coffee. The cup was still steaming, the plastic warm against her fingertips. She could have said something. Could have defended the medication pre-draws, could have cited the 3 studies showing improved outcomes in time-sensitive cardiac cases, could have mentioned that the practice was standard in every trauma unit she'd worked in across 4 continents. Could have told Whitfield that his opinions about field medicine meant approximately nothing to someone who'd actually practiced it while mortars fell like rain. Instead, she turned and walked away. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like insects. Her shoes clicked on the tile in a steady rhythm, 1, 2, 3, 4. Behind her, Whitfield's laughter carried down the corridor, already turning the moment into a story he'd tell at the next department meeting. Later, at the nurses' station, Whitfield cornered her while 3 other nurses worked nearby, deliberately public, deliberately witnessed. Your charting is creating discrepancies in my ventilator documentation, he said, his voice low enough to seem private but pitched for the room. I've been reviewing your notes, and you're recording medication timings that contradict my billing codes. Now, I need you to understand something. He paused, letting silence do its work. Security can escort you out of this facility today if your attitude doesn't improve. They'd escort you out tomorrow too, if I asked. So I need you to nod if you comprehend what I'm saying. Her jaw tightened. A muscle flickered once, near her right ear, barely visible, gone in a fraction of a second. But she nodded. Slow. Deliberate. The nod of someone who understood the power structure in the room. Whitfield smiled. Good girl. That's what I like to see. He didn't know what he was looking at. He saw a nurse taking correction. What he didn't see was the pause in her breathing, the micro-pause that came from decades of training in restraint, in the discipline required to keep your hand steady when everything in your nervous system was screaming. The trembling wasn't fear. It was the after-effect of adrenaline flooding a system trained to kill, held in check by will alone. What Whitfield did know, though he didn't realize Danielle knew it, was that her meticulous charting was destroying him. For 8 months, he'd been inflating billing codes on ventilator patients, adding hours of care that never happened, adding medications never administered, adding interventions that existed only in his documentation. 8 months of fraud that might have gone unnoticed, except that Danielle's charting created a discrepancy. Her times didn't match his times. Her medication counts didn't match his records. Her notes, detailed, accurate, documented in the precise language of someone trained in forensic precision, were creating a paper trail that auditors would eventually follow like breadcrumbs leading directly to him. He'd made 6 phone calls by the time the sun set that evening. One to board chairman Hendricks, who owed him for covering up his son's DUI arrest 3 years ago. Another to his attorney, specializing in termination cases and character assassination. A third to someone at the state nursing board. The calls were strategic, competent, made by a man who understood how institutions worked and how obligations could be called in like currency. Danielle returned to room 347 where Marcus Webb sat in his chair by the window, his service dog, a chocolate Labrador named Ranger, resting at his feet. She checked his vitals with the same calm she'd used at the vending machine, the same composure she'd held at the nurse's station. Pulse, 82. Blood pressure, 120/76. Oxygen saturation, 98% on room air. Everything normal. Everything stable. Bad day? Marcus asked. His sightless eyes tracked the sound of her voice with the precision of someone who'd learned to navigate the world through acoustics and memory. Nothing I can't handle, she said. But her hand shook once, briefly, as she typed his vitals into the computer. Just once. Just for a second. Before she steadied them and the tremor stopped and her hands became still as stone again. What would come next, neither of them knew. What was already in motion, the phone calls, the complaints being filed, the machinery of institutional power grinding into gear, was something that would test whether Danielle Ross could maintain her cover, or whether the truth was about to shatter everything she'd worked for. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that Whitfield had no idea that the woman he'd just threatened to have security escort from the building was the same woman who'd carried Marcus Webb through burning streets in Baghdad 20 years ago. He had no idea that the quiet compliance he'd just witnessed wasn't weakness at all. He had no idea who he was standing next to. The code alarm shrieked at 2:07 a.m. 3 short bursts, the kind that made every nerve in Cedar Creek Medical stand at attention. Danielle was halfway through restocking the 4 cart on the 3rd floor when the sound cut through the fluorescent-lit silence like a blade through silk. Room 319. She moved before conscious thought caught up with muscle memory, her legs carrying her down the corridor at a pace that looked casual to anyone not trained to notice. A resident froze outside the room, tablet clutched to his chest like a shield. She didn't slow down. She didn't ask permission. The post-surgical patient lay with his chest swelling like a balloon inflating in fast forward. Cardiac tamponade. Blood accumulating in the pericardial sac, compressing the heart, choking it. His blood pressure was 62/40 and dropping. His oxygen saturation flickered between 71 and 74%. The monitor showed a pulse that was there, then fainter, then almost not there at all. He had maybe 4 minutes before the heart simply stopped trying. Danielle's hands were already moving. Not hurrying. Not panicking. Just moving with the terrible efficiency of someone who'd done this in the dark under mortar fire, who'd felt arterial blood warm on her palms while rounds whistled overhead. She grabbed a spinal needle, 14 gauge, long enough to reach the pericardial sac through the xiphoid process. The resident was saying something. Words. Protocols. She didn't hear them. The world had narrowed to the sound of shallow breathing and the electrical hum of the monitor recording a heart that was running out of time. The angle was 45 degrees, just below the xiphoid, angling toward the left shoulder. Her left hand found the patient's sternum and held it steady while her right hand moved with the precision of a surgeon who'd trained in field hospitals where the only anesthesia was adrenaline and necessity. The needle went in. The resistance of tissue. Then the sudden give as the needle entered the pericardial sac. Fluid. Dark, thick, oxygen-hungry fluid draining from around the heart. 45 seconds. That's what it took. The syringe filled. Then emptied. Then filled again. 30 milliliters of blood that had been crushing a man's heart now resided in a plastic syringe in the hands of a nurse who was supposed to be organizing medication carts, not performing emergency pericardiocentesis at 2:07 a.m. in a Texas hospital where she didn't officially exist. The monitor's tone changed. The rhythm came back. Not perfect, still irregular, still angry, but present. Real. The oxygen saturation climbed like a rock thrown upward, 75, 78, 81, 84, stabilizing at 87%. The blood pressure ticked upward. 68/44. 72/48. Not perfect, but no longer a death sentence ticking down to 0. The patient's breathing deepened. His eyes fluttered. Life returning to a man who'd been seconds away from leaving it. The door opened. Dr. Whitfield stood in the threshold with his stethoscope draped around his neck like a medal he'd never earned, and his face went through a transformation that Danielle catalogued with the precision of a trained observer noting an enemy combatant's tells. Shock. Recognition. Calculation. His eyes moved from the patient to the spinal needle in Danielle's hand to her face, and she saw the exact moment his brain tried to reconcile what he was seeing with what he believed possible. What did you? His voice came out hollow. That's a restricted procedure. She didn't answer. She was already moving the patient onto his left side, already reaching for the blood pressure cuff to get a baseline, already doing the work that saved lives in the milliseconds after someone pulled you back from the edge of nothing. The resident was on his phone, calling the surgical team, calling the attending, his words tripping over each other in his rush to report what he'd just witnessed. A nurse. An unauthorized procedure. A patient who should have been dead and wasn't. Danielle's voice, when she finally spoke, was level as a laser. Get me a chest X-ray. 2 large bore 4s. Type and cross for 4 units. And contact the attending surgeon, he needs to know we have active bleeding from somewhere in the chest cavity. The words came out as orders, not requests. The resident didn't hesitate. He moved. Dr. Whitfield was still standing in the doorway, his expensive tie catching the harsh light of the monitors. His mouth opened. Closed. The calculations were happening behind his eyes, she could see them working. What this moment meant. What it threatened. The nurse he'd been systematically trying to dismantle had just saved a patient's life using a procedure that required the kind of training most physicians didn't possess. Using a procedure that raised questions about where she'd learned it, who taught her, what her actual background might be. She didn't give him time to voice those questions. Step back, doctor. We need the space. It wasn't a request. The words came out in the tone she'd spent 2 years carefully suppressing, the tone of someone accustomed to being obeyed, accustomed to command, accustomed to making decisions that meant the difference between an extraction team coming home in body bags or coming home alive. His face flushed. His jaw tightened. For a moment, she thought he might actually challenge her, might actually try to reassert whatever authority he believed he possessed in this room at this particular moment when she was literally saving a life and he was literally getting in the way. Then he stepped back. Just enough. Just far enough. The attending surgeon arrived 7 minutes later, breathless from the elevator, ready for a disaster. Instead, he found a stabilized patient with a pericardial needle drain in place, O2 sat in the mid-80s, and a nurse completing a trauma assessment with the methodical precision of someone who'd done it 1,000 times before. His eyes moved from the patient to Danielle to the resident who was still pale from what he'd witnessed. What happened here? The surgeon asked. Surgical bleeding into the pericardium, Danielle said. Cardiac tamponade. Pericardiocentesis decompression. Sinus rhythm restored at 2:08. Current vital signs stable but he's still bleeding. He's going to need to go back to the OR. The surgeon looked at Dr. Whitfield, who was standing silently in the corner, his cufflinks glinting like tiny accusations. "You authorized this procedure?" "No," Whitfield said quietly. "I didn't." The silence that followed lasted approximately 3 seconds. In those 3 seconds, the surgeon's expression shifted from confusion to understanding to something harder, something that looked a lot like the moment a man realized the thing he'd been defending wasn't what he thought it was. He turned back to Danielle. "Good work. Let's get him prepped for transport." Dr. Whitfield left the room. Danielle watched him go, watched the stiffness in his shoulders, the way his hands clenched at his sides. She knew exactly what he was thinking. She could read it in the muscle tension of his neck, the particular angle of his jaw. He was thinking about the calls he'd made, the network he'd activated, the carefully constructed case he'd been building against a nurse who was supposed to be incompetent, supposed to be reckless, supposed to fail spectacularly so he could document that failure and have her removed from Cedar Creek Medical and removed from Marcus Webb's immediate vicinity. Except she'd just saved a man's life using a procedure that most attending physicians couldn't perform. She'd done it in 45 seconds. She'd done it with the calm precision of someone who'd performed it dozens of times in conditions far more hostile than a well-lit Texas hospital. The question now wasn't whether he could fire her. The question was what he would do when the attending surgeon filed his incident report. The question was who else might start asking where exactly a nurse named Danielle Ross had learned to perform an emergency pericardiocentesis like someone who'd trained at Balboa Naval Hospital, or Bethesda, or one of the classified field surgical stations that officially didn't exist. The patient was stabilized and prepped for transport by 2:16 a.m. Danielle rode with him to the OR, documented everything with the precision she'd learned from 2 decades of incident reports that had to be perfect, had to be airtight, had to protect the mission. By the time she clocked out at 7 a.m., the hospital grapevine had already grown 3 different versions of what had happened in room 319. In one version, she'd performed an unauthorized procedure. In another, she'd saved a man's life. In a third, whispered in the break room over lukewarm coffee, she was something else entirely. Something no one could quite name. She parked her Honda in the Cedar Creek lot and sat with the engine off, rain beginning to hammer the windshield like the rhythm of a heartbeat that had almost stopped. 45 seconds. That's all it had taken to change the trajectory of everything. To reveal, in a single moment under fluorescent lights with a spinal needle and a dying man, exactly what Dr. Whitfield had been too arrogant to see. That the quiet nurse he'd been destroying with his systematic precision wasn't what he thought she was. That the hands he'd watched organize medication carts had held people together under circumstances that would have broken anyone else into pieces. The rain fell harder. And Danielle Ross, Master Chief Petty Officer, embedded at Cedar Creek Medical to protect a blind veteran from a threat she still didn't fully understand, sat in her decade-old Honda and understood with perfect clarity that her cover had just developed a crack. The question wasn't if it would shatter. The question was when. By morning, Dr. Whitfield had made his calls. The first was to Dr. Harrison Pierce, the hospital board chairman, a man who owed Whitfield for covering up his son's DUI 3 years ago. The paperwork quietly expunged, the arrest record vanished like it never happened. "We have a serious problem," Whitfield said, his voice smooth as oil on water. "A nurse named Ross. Reckless. Endangering patients. I'm moving on termination." Pierce didn't ask questions. Men like Pierce never do when debts come due. The second call went to the state nursing board liaison, a woman named Catherine Moss who'd received a referral bonus from Whitfield's clinic for 6 straight years, $5,000 annually, enough to matter. Scope creep, he told her. Performing advanced procedures without credentials. Pericardiocentesis. In a general care setting. You'll want documentation for your files. She promised to flag the license. The third call was to his attorney, a man named Stephen Bancroft who specialized in building termination cases that couldn't be challenged. Bancroft had already been paid a retainer months ago, insurance money, technically, though the insurance covered things that wouldn't appear on any ledger. "I have the ammunition," Whitfield said. "Chart documentation, incident reports, witness statements. How fast can you move?" "48 hours," Bancroft replied. "Maybe faster." Whitfield hung up and allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. The mathematics were perfect. The pericardiocentesis was his foundation, unauthorized advanced procedure, scope violation, patient endangerment narrative built in. The medication pre-drawing was secondary evidence of protocol disregard. And then there were the billing discrepancies she'd been creating by documenting his ventilator codes accurately instead of the inflated numbers he needed. If she stayed, the auditors would eventually notice the pattern. If she fought the termination, she'd have to explain why a floor nurse was performing advanced surgical procedures, which meant either admitting she had training she'd never disclosed, or admitting she acted without authority. Either way, she lost. The trap was elegant. The timing was perfect. The network of obligations and favors activated like a mechanism. Each person receiving their call knew exactly what was expected, and knew what would happen if they didn't cooperate. Whitfield had spent 12 years building these relationships, each favor carefully catalogued, each debt meticulously remembered. This was how institutional power actually worked. Not with dramatic confrontations in hallways. With phone calls made on Tuesday mornings to people who owed you. By 2:27 p.m., the machinery had moved through the system. A typed letter sat in a manila folder. Copies had been made and filed with human resources. The board chairman had made a single phone call confirming the decision was final. By 3:11 p.m., Security Chief Morrison was waiting by the time clock with a cardboard box and an expression that said he'd served 2 tours in Kandahar and had seen worse than this, but not by much. Danielle was finishing her notes on the COVID wing when Morrison found her, a Marine with silver at his temples and the kind of stance that never fully relaxed, even after civilian life. "Ross," he said quietly. Just her name. That was enough. She followed him to the administrative corridor, the fluorescent lights humming their eternal monotone. The hallway smelled like disinfectant and the particular staleness that comes from recycled air conditioning running in August. Her locker was 30 feet away. She could see it from here, the dented metal door with a faded hospital ID clipped to the frame. Morrison opened the termination letter with his hand steady as stone. His eyes were apologetic, but his voice was all business, the voice of someone delivering orders he didn't question. "Direct orders from above me," he said. "Effective immediately. Citation is reckless unauthorized procedures endangering patient safety and insubordination regarding established care protocols." The letter itemized everything. The pericardiocentesis at 2:04 a.m. The pre-drawn cardiac medications. A fabricated complaint about her medication documentation from an attending nurse she'd never spoken to, or Whitfield's handwriting disguised through a proxy, obviously, but technically documented. Every piece of evidence selected to paint a picture of a nurse operating beyond her scope, making judgment calls that endangered patients, defying protocol out of arrogance or incompetence. She read it twice. Her jaw tightened, barely visible, just the muscle at the hinge of her mandible pulling tight for a quarter second, but her hands didn't shake. Hands that had held together soldiers' spines with field-expedient tourniquets didn't shake over termination letters. The choice was hers. She could fight this. She could invoke her actual credentials, her real rank, her authority as Master Chief Petty Officer Ross, embedded here under NCIS directive to monitor Marcus Webb during his testimony in the classified investigation. One phone call to her commanding officer would dissolve this entire termination. Pentagon lawyers would eviscerate Bancroft's case in 48 hours. Whitfield's billing fraud would be the least of his problems once military investigators started pulling his records. But fighting meant exposure. It meant revealing that Marcus wasn't just a blind veteran recovering from service-related injuries. It meant showing her hand 6 days before his testimony. 6 days before a faction of former Kandahar militants, currently being tracked through 3 countries, potentially moved against a witness who could identify their operations. The security detail watching Marcus was good, but they didn't know the real threat. They weren't watching for organized targeting. They were watching for drunk behavior and medication non-compliance. She took the box. It was lighter than it should have been, just her personal items, a few photos, the fleece she kept in her locker for the over-aggressive hospital AC. Morrison's jaw worked like he wanted to say something, apologies maybe, but he was a Marine and Marines understood mission. Sometimes the mission meant you watched someone get sacrificed. "I'm sorry, Ross," he said anyway. She didn't respond. Just took the box and walked back through the corridor, past the nurse's station where 3 people suddenly became very focused on their computers, past the medication dispensary where the fluorescent lights buzzed like they always did, like nothing had changed. The parking garage at Cedar Creek Medical stretched down 6 levels, concrete on all sides, each level dimmer than the last as you descended. Most of the staff parked on levels 2 and 3. Danielle drove a 2013 Honda Civic that had 187,000 miles on the odometer and a check engine light that had been illuminated for so long she no longer registered it. She parked on level 6, in the corner where the security cameras had a dead spot, a habit from 30 years of operational security, even in places where it didn't matter anymore. By 3:51 p.m., she was sitting in that car with the box on the passenger seat and the termination letter in her hands again, reading it for the 3rd time as if the words might rearrange themselves into something different. The afternoon heat had turned the car into an oven. The steering wheel was hot enough to leave marks on her palms. She didn't turn the key. Turning the key meant deciding where to go. It meant deciding what came next. 2 years of embedded work, 2 years of watching Marcus heal, 2 years of positioning herself close enough to protect him when the investigation got hot, all of it evaporated because a doctor with billing code fraud couldn't tolerate accurate charting. The security detail would remain in place, but they wouldn't know what to watch for. The diplomatic transfer she'd observed in the patient records yesterday, the Afghan national with the scarred face, that was probably reconnaissance. Probably a test to see if the hospital was still a secure location for Marcus's recovery. She rested her forehead against the steering wheel. The plastic was hot against her skin. Her hand hovered over the ignition key but didn't turn it. The temperature in the garage dropped as afternoon shifted toward evening, the concrete walls slowly releasing the heat they'd absorbed all day. Fluorescent lights flickered on one by one as the light outside diminished, each one making a soft electrical pop as the circuits engaged. The sound was like small firearms in the distance, barely noticeable unless you were listening for it. She stayed there for 93 minutes. She knew the exact count because she watched the clock on the dashboard change from 3:33 to 4 o'clock to 4:30 to 5 o'clock to 5:20 as traffic noise from the garage entrance gradually diminished. By 5:20 p.m., the parking garage was nearly empty. A few people came and went, their footsteps echoing off the concrete, their cars starting up and pulling out toward the exit ramp. By 6:15 p.m., she was alone. The termination letter rested on her lap. The box sat beside her, her fleece and photos and the few personal items that comprised her cover life at Cedar Creek Medical. Somewhere in the hospital above her, Marcus was in his room, eating dinner probably, unaware that his protection had just been compromised. The security detail outside his door, good people, trained people, were checking their phones and thinking about their shifts ending at midnight. She pressed her forehead harder against the steering wheel, and for just a moment, one moment that lasted maybe 3 seconds, the composure that had held her together through 30 years of operations cracked just slightly. Not breaking. Not visible. But cracked, the way concrete cracks in winter when the temperature drops and the weight becomes too much for the surface to sustain. Then she straightened up. Her hand moved to the ignition. She still didn't turn it. Instead, she looked out through the windshield at the grey concrete pillars and the fluorescent darkness and the empty parking spaces stretching away in all directions like a landscape from a dream where you're trying to run but your legs don't work. What she didn't know, what nobody in Cedar Creek Medical knew, was that her termination letter had triggered a protocol. A protocol that had been waiting, dormant, for exactly this circumstance. An alert had gone to NCIS. An alert had gone to SOCOM. An alert had gone to a general's office in the Pentagon where a 2-star general named Patricia Vance had read the notification and closed her laptop and picked up a phone that didn't go through regular channels. 48 hours. That was the timeline. But sitting in that car in the parking garage, forehead resting against the steering wheel, hands gripping it like it was the only solid thing left in the world, Danielle Ross had no idea that the helicopter was already being fueled. 48 hours after they terminated her, Danielle Ross walked back through the doors of Cedar Creek Medical to collect a final paycheck she didn't need. The lobby had transformed into something that looked like a military formation pretending to be civilian space. Uniforms everywhere. Not hospital uniforms. Real ones. Navy dress blues with medal ribbons. Combat boots that had actually seen combat. A two-star general stood near the information desk, reading glasses reflecting the fluorescent glare, a manila folder in his left hand like it was the most important document in the building. He had the kind of presence that made the air pressure change. 3 junior officers stood at parade rest behind him. A chief petty officer with a scarred jaw. A warrant officer with the bearing of someone who'd made decisions that cost lives and slept fine afterward. Security had abandoned their posts. The retired Army veteran at the desk, Hammond, had been there 20 years, stood rigid, his posture transformation so complete that his uniform from 1997 might as well have still fit him. The general's eyes tracked across the room like a man cataloguing positions. Then he saw her. His expression didn't change. But the lieutenant colonel beside him straightened almost imperceptibly. The chief petty officer's jaw tightened. Hammond took a sharp breath through his nose. That's when the former Taliban fighter in the wheelchair near the window began to tremble. Not from fear. From recognition. His eyes widened as they met Danielle's across the lobby, and his voice dropped to a whisper in Pashto that somehow every military person in the room understood without translation. Al-Malik al-Azraq. The Blue Angel. It cannot be. Danielle's step didn't falter. Her face remained perfectly neutral. But her right hand found the coin in her pocket. That old, tarnished thing. The one Dr. Whitfield had never even noticed. Hammond moved then. Not toward his desk. Toward her. His voice cracked like a command on a parade ground, loud enough that people 3 floors up heard the words clearly, Master Chief Petty Officer on deck. Attention! Every uniform in the lobby turned. Every spine straightened. Every head aligned. The 2 elevator doors chimed open at exactly the wrong moment, releasing a nurse and a resident, both of whom immediately understood something fundamental had shifted in the gravity of the room and pressed themselves against the wall. The 2-star general closed the folder deliberately and approached her with the kind of measured pace that came from 3 decades of controlling rooms without raising his voice. When he stopped, there was exactly 6 feet of space between them. He opened the folder. His reading glasses caught the light again. Master Chief Petty Officer Danielle Ross, he began, and his voice was smooth as a tank idling in a garage, powerful and barely engaged. 3 bronze stars for Valor under fire. The first in Kandahar, 2009. The second in Fallujah, 2011. The third in Sanjin Valley, 2014. He paused. The silence lasted exactly 2 seconds. Then he continued. 2 Purple Hearts. 1 from shrapnel during the extraction mission in Baghdad in 2004. 1 from a 7.62 round that caught you in the left shoulder during Operation Iraqi Freedom, 2008. Another pause. The folder turned. And the Navy Cross. For actions on behalf of 12 wounded Marines during the Helmand Province incursion. Under fire for 43 minutes. All 12 extracted. 0 casualties. He lowered the glasses. 23 years of service. 18 years classified. For military districts. 3 continents. Marcus Webb stood then, though no one had called for him to stand. His service dog rose with him. A German shepherd with the bearing of a weapon that had decided to love anyway. The blind veteran moved through the lobby with the kind of confidence that came from knowing every step by heart, or perhaps by something deeper. He stopped directly in front of Dr. Whitfield, who had just emerged from the administrative hallway, probably drawn by the disruption. Whitfield's face had already begun to drain of color before Marcus even moved. The veteran's hand opened. The coin sat in his palm. The same tarnished coin. the one with the Special Forces insignia worn almost smooth by 20 years of carrying it. He extended it toward Whitfield with the precision of someone performing a ritual that mattered. "She took shrapnel in her spine carrying me to the helicopter," Marcus said quietly. Voice like someone who'd learned to speak while wounded and never forgot the lesson. 8 months learning to walk again. Physical therapy in the dark. Never told anyone. Never mentioned the pain. Because the mission always came first. Always. Marcus's sightless eyes found the general's position by sound alone. "She's been my guardian for 20 years. And you tried to destroy her because she saved a life the way soldiers are trained to save lives." The silence that followed lasted 10 seconds exactly. Someone's phone buzzed. Nobody answered it. The ventilation system hummed. Thunder rolled across Houston somewhere distant, and for a moment it felt like the sky itself was taking attendance. Then 2 figures in dark suits emerged from the stairwell. Federal bearing. The kind of composed intensity that came from years of arriving at moments exactly like this one. Special Agent Reeves had the folder. Special Agent KO had the handcuffs clipped to her belt. They moved with the fluid precision of apex predators that had already made their kill decision. "Dr. Whitfield," Reeves said, and it wasn't a greeting. "We need to discuss your hospital database access from 11 p.m. last night." Whitfield's mouth opened. Nothing came out. His hand, the one that had held the coin for exactly 4 seconds, began to tremble. Genuine terror. Not the calculated kind. The real kind. The kind that comes from understanding that the room you thought you controlled just became a courtroom and you're already convicted. KO stepped closer. Her voice was level as a laser. "You accessed Danielle Ross's personnel file. Modified entries. Added fabricated incident reports. Altered medication timestamps." She pulled a tablet from her jacket. The screen showed database logs. Timestamps. Whitfield's user ID. "Our cybercrime unit has been monitoring Cedar Creek's billing systems for 6 months. Medicare fraud indicators on your ventilator coding triggered a federal investigation in March. Everything you did last night is documented. Every keystroke. Every change. Every lie." "I want my lawyer," Whitfield whispered. KO's expression didn't shift. "You attempted to forge federal employment records. Master Chief Ross is a federal employee on classified assignment. You violated 18 U.S.C. Section 1001. That's falsifying records of the federal government and obstruction of a federal investigation." The handcuffs appeared like a magician's trick, except this was real. "You have the right to remain silent." The cuffs clicked. Whitfield's knees buckled slightly. KO caught his arm with casual strength, the way someone handles cargo that's already worthless. Reeves guided him toward the lobby doors. The television cameras were already outside. Someone had called the local stations. The images would make the evening news by 6 p.m. By morning, Whitfield's medical license would be suspended. By week 2, the fraud would spiral into headlines that mentioned Cedar Creek Medical by name. The board chairman would authorize an immediate internal review. The billing department would uncover 8 months of falsified codes. The scope would balloon. 17 counts by the time the federal prosecutors finished. $23 million in false billings. The insurance companies would sue. The hospital would settle. Whitfield would lose his license permanently, his freedom temporarily, and his career entirely. But that wasn't the moment that mattered. The moment that mattered was Marcus Webb placing his hand on Danielle's shoulder as the federal agents walked Dr. Whitfield past the television cameras gathering outside like vultures who'd finally found something worth filming. The moment was the general saying quietly, "Welcome back to duty, Master Chief." The moment was Hammond straightening his posture and saluting, the kind of salute that said thank you and I'm sorry and I understand all at once. 6 months later, Walter Reed National Military Medical Center in Bethesda, Maryland. Danielle stood beside Marcus in pre-op for his corneal transplant surgery. The donor match had come through military medical channels, a donation coordinated with the kind of efficiency that only happens when the Pentagon makes a request. Marcus wore a surgical gown that made him look smaller, though that was an illusion created by the fluorescent lights and the magnitude of what was about to happen. "Scared?" she asked him. He grinned. "You pulled me out of a burning Humvee in Baghdad. This is easy." The surgery lasted for hours. When the bandages came off 3 weeks later, the first face Marcus Webb saw clearly in 20 years was hers. Not through instruments. Not through memory. Through his own eyes, finally restored, finally open. He cried. She did too, though only briefly, the way someone cries when a mission finally completes. Back in Houston, Dr. Whitfield sat at a folding table outside a strip mall on Westheimer Road, under a banner that read, "Affordable coverage, ask me how." His shirt collar was frayed. His shoes were from a discount outlet. The stack of insurance pamphlets in front of him had grown dusty. A former colleague from Cedar Creek passed by on Tuesday. Didn't make eye contact. Nobody ever did anymore. At Cedar Creek Medical, a new plaque hung in the lobby in polished brass, the Danielle Ross Patient Advocacy Award for Courage Beyond Protocol. 3 nurses had already received it. The award criteria stated plainly, exceptional medical judgment. Willingness to challenge authority when patient safety demands it. Moral courage in the face of institutional pressure. Danielle kept the tarnished challenge coin in her pocket during every shift at her new position, NCIS Medical Liaison, attached to Naval Medical Command. The coin was heavier than it looked, or maybe her hands had just learned to carry weight differently. Marcus returned to active duty with 3rd Battalion, 5th Marine Special Operations Command. His vision was perfect now. His aim was still better. On her last day at Cedar Creek for the transition ceremony, a young nurse, couldn't have been more than 6 months into her first job, approached her in the break room. The question came out rushed, like it had been building pressure for weeks. "How did you do it? Stay calm when he was destroying you?" "I would have fallen apart. I would have cried. I would have quit." Danielle touched the coin in her pocket. The metal was still cool. The insignia still sharp. She'd carried it through Baghdad and Kandahar and Houston. Through humiliation and termination and vindication. Through the hardest part, staying silent when screaming would have felt so good. "Power is not a title," she said quietly. "Power is the ability to help. Everything else is just noise." The young nurse nodded slowly, like she was translating a language she didn't speak yet, but understood she needed to learn. Danielle squeezed her shoulder, brief, firm, the way you touch someone to let them know they're not alone, and walked toward the door. Marcus was waiting in the lobby. Seeing her clearly now. Finally. After all these years of darkness, he could see the strength in her face. The quiet that wasn't submission. The composure that was actually armor. He smiled. She smiled back. And neither of them said anything, because after 20 years, some conversations don't need words. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your real value, please subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell. Share your story in the comments, we read every single one. And if you believe institutional accountability matters as much as individual courage, like this video. Because heroes walk among us. Sometimes in scrubs. Sometimes invisible. But always, always fighting.